Imagine just for a second that you are traveling 36 meters every single second.
Which is just an insane speed to even visualize.
Right. You're completely exposed to the elements. Your heart is pounding against your ribs, and you are just hurtling down a 40-degree sheet ice slope.
Yeah, and when you watch downhill skiing on TV, it just looks so graceful, like this effortless gliding.
It really does. But at 130 kilometers per hour, what looks like gliding is actually, well, it's a brutal, unforgiving biomechanical war taking place inside the human body.
Oh, absolutely. It's absolute chaos disguised as elegance. I mean, the physical forces involved here are so extreme that, biomechanically speaking, the human skeleton shouldn't really be able to withstand them.
Let alone control those forces with like millimeter precision while essentially falling off a mountain.
Right, exactly.
Which is the entire focus of our deep dive today. We've got our hands on this incredibly detailed set of materials presented by Dr. Christophe Delong in Kinexa Formation.
Yeah, and the research is just phenomenal.
It is. They've meticulously dissected the anatomy, the neurology, and the psychology of a champion downhill skier. So we are going to unpack exactly what happens inside a skier's body and brain during a 90-second race.
The level of detail in their work is staggering. They literally tracked nerve signals down to the millisecond. And they mapped out how individual muscle fibers survive when they're literally suffocating under their own force.
That's intense. So our mission today is to figure out why these athletes are, in some terrifying moments, quite literally skiing blind.
Mm-hmm.
We'll explore how this tiny, highly specialized sniper muscle prevents their knees from just exploding on the course.
Mm-hmm.
And we're going to look at why, when you see a heartbreaking crash right at the finish line, it is almost never the legs that actually gave out.
That last point is completely counterintuitive, right? Because you watch a skier's legs absorbing all that violent punishment, bouncing over ruts at highway speeds.
Yeah, you naturally just assume the legs are the first thing to fail.
Exactly. But the reality of high-speed performance is so much more complex. The breakdown actually starts from the top down.
Well, then let's start at the top, because before we even get to the muscles acting as shock absorbers, we really have to look at the command center.
Right, the brain.
Yeah. At 130 kilometers per hour, the human brain runs into a severe physical processing speed limit.
It really is a fundamental limit of our biology. The data from Dr. DeLong lays out the exact timeline of a human reaction. So let's say a skier is coming over a crest and sees a sudden bump or maybe a change in the snow texture.
Okay.
The retina registers that image. Then it sends a signal to the visual cortex to process what that shape is. The visual cortex talks to the motor cortex, which decides what physical action to take.
Right.
And then that signal has to travel all the way down the spinal cord to the leg muscles.
Which, to most of us, sounds pretty instantaneous.
In everyday life, it totally is. But that entire process takes about 200 to 250 milliseconds, so a quarter of a second.
But let's do the math based on what we established earlier. If you're traveling 36 meters per second, a quarter of a second means you've already traveled 9 meters.
Wow, yeah. 9 meters of pure blind momentum.
That's crazy.
By the time the leg muscle actually twitches to react to that visual stimulus, the skier has traveled 30 feet past the optimal point of action. They are physically incapable of reacting to what they are seeing in real time.
So it's basically like driving down a highway in a thick fog, but your brake pedal has a 2-second mechanical delay built into it.
That's a great way to put it.
Right. Because if you wait until you see the stopped car in front of you to hit the brakes, the crash has already happened. So how on earth do you steer if your biology prevents you from reacting to what's right in front of you?
You don't react. That is the secret. Champion skiers do not ski what they see. They ski what they have already memorized.
Wait, really? Everything is memorized?
Everything. During the course inspections before the race, they aren't just, looking at the snow conditions or chatting with their coaches. They're building a highly detailed, 3-dimensional neural map in their hippocampus and parietal cortex.
So they're essentially programming an internal autopilot before they ever click into their bindings.
Exactly. Predictive piloting is the technical term. During the race, their brain is actually anticipating 2 to 3 seconds ahead of their current physical location.
So they're mentally 60 to 100 meters down the mountain.
Right. And at these speeds, when they hit a terrain compression, which is a sudden, steep drop, the geometry of the mountain literally masks the next gate. The terrain drops away, and there's nothing but sky in their field of vision.
So they're just plunging into a void. For a half second, or maybe even a full second, They have zero visual confirmation of where they need to turn.
They are completely blind to the target. But because of that neural map they built during inspection, their mirror neurons activate. Their brain basically sees the gate mentally, even though their physical eyes cannot. Yeah, so they begin shifting their weight and executing the turn before the gate ever appears in their field of vision.
But what happens if that memory fails? Like, say the wind blew some loose snow over a patch of ice, changing the texture from what they memorized that morning.
Then they're forced back into relying on real-time visual processing. And as we just established, they only have a fraction of a second to adjust, but a real-world reaction takes a quarter of a second.
So the math just doesn't work.
It doesn't work. That gap between perception and reaction is usually when you see those spectacular, really terrifying wipeouts.
That actually brings up a huge question about the skier's mental state. Because if I'm blind dropping into a turn at highway speeds, trusting a memory of a gate I can't even see, my brain is going to be screaming at me to hit the brakes.
Oh yeah, the self-preservation instinct would be paralyzing.
Right, a normal brain would absolutely paralyze you with fear.
Which is exactly why the champion's brain undergoes this temporary radical rewiring. Dr. DeLong's research details how the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of your brain responsible for conscious thought, complex planning, and most importantly, doubt, it essentially powers down. It goes quiet.
It just unplugs so you can't overthink the danger?
It has to unplug, because if you stop to think, you crash. So by shutting down those conscious thought processes, the brain manages to silence the amygdala, which is our fear center.
That is wild.
It enters a profound flow state governed almost entirely by the primitive brain, the brainstem and the cerebellum.
So there's no internal monologue happening at all. They aren't telling themselves, bend your knees or keep your weight forward.
None whatsoever. It's pure, unfiltered sensory motor execution. And a fascinating byproduct of this intense primitive flow state is massive time dilation.
Really? Time dilation.
Yeah. To the conscious observer, it's a chaotic 90-second run. But to the skier, their perception of time slows down drastically. That minute and a half can feel like 3 or 4 minutes of sustained, hyper-focused reality.
Wow. So it stretches out, allowing them to perceive micro-adjustments in the snow that we can't even see on the TV broadcast.
Exactly.
Okay, so the primitive brain sends this anticipatory, pre-programmed signal down the spinal cord. We need to follow that signal down to the joint, taking the absolute worst of the physical punishment on the mount, the knee.
This brings us to the real biomechanical engine of the downhill skier. When that nerve signal reaches the thigh, it hits the quadriceps. But the biomechanical data from Kinexa formation highlights one specific critical piece of anatomy that is doing the heavy lifting.
And this is the vastus medialis oblique, right? The VMO.
That's the one.
Yeah, I had to stop and reread the notes on this section because we aren't talking about the massive, thick front of the thigh muscle here. The VMO is this highly specialized, tiny segment just above the inside of the kneecap. It's like only about 25 millimeters thick.
Its size is super deceiving, but its architecture is what makes it vital. Most of your thigh muscle fibers run somewhat vertically to extend the leg and push you up.
Right.
But the VMO fibers are angled at 15 to 55 degrees relative to the femur.
So they're pulling sideways across the leg, not up and down.
Exactly. It acts as the sniper muscle. Its primary job isn't to push the skier up. Its job is to pull the kneecap inward.
Okay, so think about the physics of a long turn. The massive outer part of the thigh muscle, the vastus lateralis, is firing with unbelievable force.
Right, and all of that force wants to yank the kneecap right off its track to the outside of the leg.
But the VMO, with that specific 55-degree angle, is the only thing fighting that outward pull, anchoring the patella in place. Wait, I need to make sure I'm visualizing this correctly.
Go ahead.
A tiny muscle segment, roughly the thickness of your thumb, is the sole anchor, preventing a champion skier from suffering a shattered, dislocated knee.
It is terrifying, but yes, let's look at the math of those forces. In a long, high-speed turn, a downhill skier pulls 3 to 4 Gs.
3 to 4 Gs, that's like fighter pilot territory.
Yeah, and the VMO has to generate between 600 and 900 newtons of force just to keep the kneecap aligned while the rest of the thigh tries to rip it outward. It is a titanic amount of work for such a small segment of tissue.
What happens if that pre-programmed brain signal we just talked about is slightly delayed, like, say, a few milliseconds late getting to this sniper muscle?
The margin for error basically doesn't exist. The research specifies that if the VMO activates even 10 to 30 milliseconds late compared to the rest of the thigh muscle, the kneecap drifts outward.
It's just 10 milliseconds.
Just 10 to 30. Under 3 to 4 Gs of force, that microscopic delay causes the kneecap to grind abnormally against the cartilage. It only takes a few fractions of a second of that grinding to permanently shred the joint.
Oh, man. And as if holding back hundreds of pounds of lateral force wasn't enough, the VMO is also operating under conditions that should technically destroy it. The notes mention something about tetanic contraction and ischemia.
Yeah, those are crucial concepts here.
Can we break those down? Because when I hear tetanic, I think of tetanus like stepping on a rusty nail and your jaw locking up. Is the muscle literally locking itself in place?
That is a perfect comparison, actually. A typical high-speed turn can last 2 to 4 seconds. And for a muscle, holding a maximum contraction for 4 seconds without a single moment of release is an absolute eternity.
Wow.
It creates that tetanic contraction, meaning the muscle fibers are locked tight, there's no pulsing, no resting, just a solid, unbroken squeeze.
And ischemia, what does that mean in this context?
Ischemia refers to a lack of blood supply. Because the muscle is squeezed so tightly in this locked state, the internal pressure skyrockets. The pressure inside the VMO hits 80 to 120 millimeters of mercury.
Meaning what, practically speaking?
Meaning the internal pressure of the muscle is actually higher than the blood pressure inside the capillaries trying to feed it.
Oh, wow. So the muscle squeezes so hard, it physically crushes its own blood vessels.
Exactly. It's autostrangulation. The VMO blocks its own oxygen supply. Within seconds, the muscle is forced to operate in a completely anaerobic state.
And without oxygen, lactic acid just floods the tissue.
Plugs it, reaching extreme saturation levels of 15 to 20 millimoles per liter.
Which translates, for the athlete, to that infamous hot knife sensation. The muscle is burning from the inside out because it's literally marinating in acid.
Yeah, and that acid does more than just cause pain. It physically disrupts the calcium channels within the muscle cells, making the tissue less responsive to the brain's signals.
Oh no. Which immediately increases the risk of that deadly 10 to 30 millisecond delay we just talked about.
Precisely. It is a vicious, compounding cycle of fatigue.
Okay, so the knee's acting as this desperate, suffocating shock absorber, holding back 900 newtons of force. But the rest of the body can't just be loose, right? I mean, it's like trying to fire a heavy artillery cannon from a canoe.
That's a brilliant way to picture it.
Without a massive, rigid base to anchor the recoil, the energy just destroys the vessel. What keeps the skier's spine from snapping under the remaining G-force?
Well, you've just described the function of the core. The biomechanical secret of a champion is something called dissociation of the belts.
Explain dissociation in this context.
Visualize the human body divided into 2 halves. The lower belt consists of the pelvis and legs. The upper belt is the shoulders and chest.
Okay, got it.
To carve down a mountain at those speeds, the lower body has to move violently side to side, absorbing bumps and creating extreme angles with the skis. But the upper body must remain utterly locked, facing straight down the fall line of the mountain.
Right, because if your shoulders turn with your skis, the rotational force just spins you completely out of control.
Exactly. Keeping that upper body perfectly locked while the lower body twists violently creates monumental anti-rotational torque. This is where the internal and external obliques, your side abdominal muscles step in.
Yeah.
They aren't just flexing for stability, they act as rigid tension suspension cables fighting the rotational torque generated by the skis.
I am trying to physically imagine doing this.
Yeah.
Your legs are twisting one way, your shoulders are fighting to stay perfectly straight, and your core is holding maximum tension to keep your spine from snapping.
It's a full body war.
If your abdominals are contracted at 100% capacity just to maintain this chassis, how do these athletes breathe?
They physically cannot belly breathe.
Wait, what?
Yeah, the abdomen is a fortress of isometric tension. Taking a deep breath would require relaxing the core, which would instantly compromise the spine. So they rely on a technique called paradoxical respiration.
Paradoxical respiration.
Because the diaphragm is trapped by that core tension, skiers use high costal and scapular breathing. They use the tiny intercostal muscles between their ribs and the scalene muscles up in their neck, just to pull the upper rib cage up and sip very shallow breaths of air.
You're kidding. They are breathing using their neck muscles while doing a max sweep plank at highway speeds.
It's incredibly inefficient, but it's literally the only biomechanical option available to them. However, they do have a specific technique to deal with that auto-strangulation of the knee we discussed earlier.
Okay, how do they survive that?
To survive the VMO choking off its own blood supply, champions execute a micro-decompression.
How does that work?
So between turns, as the skier shifts their weight from one edge to the other, there's a tiny transition phase that lasts maybe half a second. In that incredibly brief window, the skier executes a violent, explosive exhale through the mouth. Think of a boxer sharply exhaling when throwing a punch.
Just a sharp, forceful burst of air, like a grunt almost.
Exactly. That explosive exhale briefly drops the immense internal pressure of the core cavity. For just a fraction of a second, that drop in pressure allows fresh arterial blood, specifically from the descending genicular artery, to rush back into the starving VMO muscle.
Wow.
It provides this microdose of oxygen that buys the muscle just enough time to survive the auto-strangulation of the very next turn.
They are micromanaging their internal blood pressure with explosive half-second breaths while literally falling down a mountain. It is just staggering to think about.
It truly is the definition of extreme physiology.
Which leads us to the breaking point. We have an oxygen-starved brain, a suffocating knee, and locked-up abdominal muscles relying on neck breathing. What happens to this entire system when the race clock crosses the 60-second mark?
The skier enters the red zone. The lactic acid buildup is now severe, circulating not just in the legs, but throughout the entire body. But here is the most crucial insight from the Kinexa formation data. It is almost never the legs that give out first.
Hold on. Whenever I watch the Olympics, I literally see their legs wobbling and giving out near the finish line. You can see the skis chattering. How can the data say the legs aren't the failure point?
Because the leg wobble is a symptom, not the cause. The core fails first. The abdominal wall and the spinal erectors simply cannot maintain that 100% isometric tension anymore. The dissociation of the belt breaks down, and when the core weakens, the pelvis tilts backward into what is known as the back seat position.
Oh, I see. And once the pelvis tilts back, your center of gravity shifts. You lose your leverage over the front of the skis.
Exactly. The skis wash out and start skidding instead of carving. The legs wobble because they are desperately trying to regain leverage from a compromised backward-leaning position. But the initial failure happened in the abdominal wall.
That makes so much sense.
And the breakdown cascades up to the upper body, too. Look at the arms. When you watch a skier, you see them planting their poles just before a turn, right?
Right. I always assumed that was a physical pivot point, like a crutch to momentarily lean on for balance.
It's actually a neurological trigger. The research explains that when the pole strikes the snow, it sends a shock wave up the arm, traveling rapidly along the radial and median nerves.
Okay.
That tactile signal hits the cerebellum in 20 to 30 milliseconds. It acts like a synaptic metronome. It tells the brain, okay, the ground is exactly here, unweight the legs now, change edges.
Wow, it's literally a physical click track to keep the brain and body perfectly synchronized.
Exactly. But in the red zone, the arms are exhausted from holding that aerodynamic tuck position, which requires constant asymmetric tension in the triceps and shoulders. The arms get heavy, they start to drop.
And the pole plants get sloppy.
The pole plants become lazy, soft, or late. Suddenly, that synaptic metronome is offbeat. The neurological synchronization between the upper body and the legs begins to disintegrate.
And what happens to the head? You mentioned earlier that the neck muscles are pulling double duty just to help the skier sip air.
Well, the head has arguably the most important job of all. It acts as a biological gimbal. Through something called the vestibulo-ocular reflex, the neck muscles make micro-adjustments in milliseconds to keep the eyes perfectly level, even while the skis are violently vibrating at 50 hertz beneath them.
So the inner ear and the eyes stay stable while the body shakes.
Right. But as those neck muscles fatigue from breathing and fighting G-forces, that biological gimbal gets shaky. If the head isn't stable, the inner ear gets confused, the vision blurs. The predictive neural map we talked about earlier starts to fail.
So to bring this all together, when we see a skier crash just 3 gates from the finish line, and the broadcast announcers call it a slight technical error, that doesn't really capture the reality at all, does it?
It completely misses the underlying physiology. By the bottom of the course, the massive thigh muscles have hoarded so much of the body's circulating blood supply that the brain is left in a state of relative hypoxia.
It's literally starving for oxygen.
Yes, drastically starving. That crisp 200 millisecond reaction time we discussed at the start of the deep dive. Due to hypoxia, it jumps to 300 milliseconds or more.
Wow.
The working memory degrades. The ski transitions from anticipating the mountain to merely reacting to it. They are no longer 2 seconds ahead in their neural map. They're living in a delayed, exhausting present.
And when you're traveling 36 meters a second, living in the delayed present means you are almost guaranteed to crash.
Exactly. It just becomes a battle of pure psychological endurance. The sources highlight this fascinating psychological divide at this stage. Amateurs, when they hit this hypoxic red zone of pain, tend to fight it. They tense up, hoping to muscle through, which actually burns more energy and wastes precious oxygen.
And the champions, how do they handle the red zone differently?
Champions accept the pain. They welcome it as an inevitable companion. They've mapped out the pain during training just like they mapped out the course. They know exactly which gate will trigger that hot knife feeling in the VMO, and they have an internal pre-programmed dialogue to handle it.
That is wild.
It becomes less about executing perfect skiing technique and entirely about how much physiological torture the brain is willing to tolerate for the final 15 seconds.
It is genuinely staggering. When you look at the reality presented by Dr. Delong in Kinexa formation, you realize that a downhill skier is not just an athlete relying on good balance and strong legs. They are a highly tuned hybrid of human and machine.
Oh, without a doubt. They're utilizing pre-programmed neural maps, executing micro-decompression breathing techniques in half-second windows, and demonstrating an immense, almost superhuman tolerance for pain, all just to survive physical forces that would systematically destroy a normal human body.
It makes you look at the sport completely differently. You're not watching someone slide down a snowy hill. You're watching a masterclass in biomechanical survival.
An incredible mental override. The ability to just switch off the fear center of your own brain on command is a profound neurological feat.
It really is. The brain's adaptability is the true marvel here, which actually brings me to a final thought I want to leave you with. We've spent this entire deep dive talking about the race, the mechanics of the 90 seconds on the ice. But think about life after the race.
The transition back to civilian life, so to speak.
Yeah. If a champion's brain has been literally rewired over 10,000 hours of training to shut off the fear center, to ignore agonizing physical pain, and to flood the body with extreme levels of dopamine and adrenaline just to survive, what happens when they cross the finish line, take off their boots, and go home?
That's a great question.
Consider the profound neurochemical addiction to that extreme primitive flow state. How does an ordinary quiet Tuesday afternoon feel to a brain that has evolved to need 130 kilometers per hour just to feel fully alive? It's a lingering question about the hidden psychological cost of extreme performance. You build a brain specifically to survive the chaos of the mountain, but then you have to figure out how to live in the quiet.
The very neurological adaptations that keep them alive on the ice might make ordinary life feel incredibly slow, perhaps even, understimulating.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Something to chew on the next time you're stuck in afternoon traffic, wishing you were going just a little bit faster. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.